The desert's heat shimmered like a hallucination, distorting the horizon into a wavering line between earth and oblivion. Boone Holt's mare, Dusty, plodded forward, her coat slick with sweat that evaporated before it could glisten, leaving only a ghostly salt crust on her flanks. Each hoofbeat seemed to sink deeper into the parched ground, as though the land itself resented their intrusion. Boone's throat burned, his canteen long emptied hours ago. But the dryness wasn't just thirst, it was the weight of unspoken words, the ache of a man who'd forgotten how to speak aloud the names he carried like shackles. The sun hung low now, bruising the sky with hues of rust and ash, casting long shadows that twisted into shapes he refused to name. His fingers brushed the revolver again, not for comfort, but to confirm its presence, a metal truth in a world where memories blurred like mirages. Dusty stumbled over a hidden rock, her breath snorting in protest, and Boone's grip tightened instinctively, his legs pressing into her ribs with a pressure born of habit, not malice. He glanced down at his boots, scuffed and cracked from years of use. The leather stained darker in patches where blood, or was it just dirt, had seeped into the grain. A vulture circled overhead, its wings rigid as a crucifix, and Boone wondered if it had mistaken him for carrion, a man moving through the world with the hollow gait of the dead. He spat onto the ground, the gesture bitter and automatic, as if to prove he could still taste life, still feel the grit of it clinging to his teeth. The wind shifted, carrying with it a scent that made his stomach knot. Rot? Yes, but beneath it, something sharper. Fear. Not the clean terror of a gunfight, but the sour, primal stench of something helpless trapped in the throes of endurance. Dusty's ears flattened, her pace slowing, and Boone felt it too. The desert's stillness fracturing, as if the land were exhaling after holding its breath for centuries. His jaw ached from clenching, his mind flashing to the way his son's small hand had gone limp in his, how the fever had hollowed the boy's cheeks until he looked like a wizened stranger. He shook his head violently, the memory shattering like glass under a boot. No, this was different. The whimper came again, fainter now, threaded with exhaustion, and Boone's chest tightened. Not grief this time, but a raw, animal urgency. Something was out there, alive and breaking, and the desert had finally decided to show him what it had been hiding. The sun dipped lower, bleeding amber across the sky, its fading light casting long shadows that danced like specters over the dunes. The buzzards circled tighter now, their wings slicing the air in lazy arcs, as if drawn by the faint, desperate sounds Boone had followed. Their cries echoed, sharp and hollow, like the laughter of something ancient and unfeeling. Dusty's hooves sank deeper into the sand, her steps hesitant, her ears twitching forward like compass needles pointing to something unseen. The desert, usually so still, thrummed with an eerie tension, the kind that prickled at the back of Boone's neck and made his hand drift toward his revolver again, though he knew the threat here wasn't armed. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with the weight of what lay ahead. Between two towering barrel cacti, their spines bristling like sentinels, the figures emerged, a tangle of dust, sweat, and despair. Two boys huddled against the cactus bases, their wrists bound to the plant's thorny ribs with rusted wire that gleamed dull in the dying light. Their faces were smudged with dirt and streaked with dried tears, lips cracked and split from dehydration, but it was their eyes that froze Boone mid-step. Wide, unblinking, pupils dilated not just from fear, but from a primal, raw understanding of how close they'd come to vanishing into the sands. Their small bodies pressed into the cactus for support, their shoulders trembling as if the weight of the world had settled there. The older one, later to be named Tate Brennan, stirred first, his head lolling upward with a groan that sounded like gravel grinding. His voice, when it came, was a ragged whisper, sandpaper scraping bone. Don't hurt him. Please." The plea was directed at Boone, but his gaze flicked to his brother, Wyatt Holt, who lay slumped beside him, his breathing shallow, his body trembling like a leaf caught in a storm. Boone's throat tightened, the memory of his own son's final, fevered breaths clawing at his chest. He dismounted slowly, the creak of leather and jingle of his saddle's hardware loud in the stillness, and knelt just beyond arm's reach. Dusty shifted uneasily behind him, her breath snorting softly as if she, too, sensed the fragility of the moment. Boone didn't reach for his knife first. Instead, he fumbled for his canteen, its metal cool and familiar in his calloused grip. He unscrewed the cap with deliberate slowness, ensuring every move was visible, predictable. The boys flinched anyway, their bodies recoiling as if expecting a blow. When Boone tilted the canteen, letting a single drop of water kiss Tate's cracked lips, the boy shuddered violently, then lunged. His small hands clamped around the canteen like a drowning man clutching driftwood, his throat convulsing as he drank in frantic gulps, water spilling down his chin and soaking his threadbare shirt. Wyatt stirred at the sound, his eyelids fluttering open to reveal bloodshot eyes, and Boone repeated the motion, offering the canteen with a steady hand until Wyatt, too, seized it, his trembling fingers brushing Boone's in a touch so fleeting it might have been accidental. The wire was the next hurdle. Boone's knife flashed in the twilight as he drew it, the blade's edge catching the last light of day. He worked carefully, his jaw clenched against the bile rising in his throat as he saw the raw, blistered skin beneath the bindings. Flesh rubbed raw, blood crusted into the grooves of their wrists. Tate winced but didn't pull away, his breath hitching in short, uneven bursts as Boone sawed through the wire. When the final strand snapped, the boys didn't move. They stayed hunched where they were, shoulders hunched, as if unsure what to do with the sudden absence of pain or the presence of someone who hadn't struck them. Boone wrapped his duster around them both, the fabric swallowing their slight frames, and lifted them with a gentleness he hadn't known he possessed. Their bones felt like twigs, their hearts pounding like trapped birds against his chest. As he mounted Dusty, one boy clinging to his shirt and the other burying his face in Boone's shoulder, the desert wind shifted, carrying the buzzards' cries away. For the first time in years, Boone felt the weight of purpose settle in his chest, not as a burden, but as a lifeline. The ride back was a blur of grit and silence. Dusty's hooves kicked up clouds of sand that clung to Boone's boots, the grains finding their way into every crease of his duster. The boys clung to him, their breaths warm against his chest, their small hands gripping handfuls of his shirt as if it were the last tether to life. The desert stretched endlessly around them, its vastness a stark contrast to the fragile warmth of the boys' presence. Boone's mind raced, thoughts of his wife's laughter, his son's small hands reaching for his, the hollow ache of an empty house waiting at the edge of Dry Creek. He wondered if the boys remembered their mother's voice, if they'd ever hear it again. The wind howled, swallowing the questions before they could fester. Ahead, the town's faint lights blinked like distant stars, a promise or a warning. Boone's grip tightened. Whatever came next, he'd face it. The boy's hearts beat against his ribs, a rhythm louder than grief, louder than fear. For the first time in years, the desert didn't feel like a graveyard. It felt like a threshold. The wire's edge had bitten deep, its serrated grooves leaving a pattern of ruptured skin and swollen ridges that pulsed a sickly pink beneath the grime. Boone's fingers lingered on the broken flesh, his calloused thumb brushing a ridge of scar tissue already forming, a grotesque badge of survival. He wondered how long they'd been there, wrists pinned to the cactus spine, the desert sun baking their screams into the air until only silence remained. The knife trembled again, not from hesitation, but the force of his rage channeled into the blade, threatening to snap it clean through. When the final strand gave, the boys' arms sagged like cut marionettes, their hands curling inward, stiff and claw-like, as if muscle memory refused to release the fight. Boone's stomach churned. He'd seen men gut-shot and twitching, their entrails spilling warm into the dirt. But this was slower, crueler. A child's body wasn't meant to bear the weight of malice. Dusty's saddle creaked under the uneven load as Boone adjusted his grip, the boy's limbs dangling like frayed ropes against his thighs. Wyatt's nails dug into his coat, the boy's face buried in the hollow of Boone's shoulder, his breath coming in shallow hitches that tickled through the fabric like the skitter of insects. Tate's fevered cheek pressed against Boone's chest, his skin clammy and flushed, the heat of it seeping through layers of cotton and leather like a brand. Every jolt of the horse's gait drew a muffled whimper from one or the other, their pain a chorus that gnawed at Boone's resolve. He kept his voice low, a rumble meant to soothe more than speak, but the words felt hollow, almost their hold on, platitudes that rang false against the vastness of the desert's indifference. Dusty's ears flicked backward, her nostrils flaring at the boy's scent. Sweat, blood, and something acrid, like fear, had corroded their pores. Dry Creek's outskirts loomed like a mirage, the first sagging shacks leaning into the wind, their boarded windows gaping sockets in a skull. A stray dog slunk between the buildings, its ribs visible beneath mangy fur, and it paused to watch Boone pass, its yellowed teeth bared in a silent snarl. The saloon sign groaned overhead, the letters the Mariposa half erased by sandstorms, the rest hanging by splintered nails. A lantern flickered inside, casting a jaundiced glow onto the porch where a man sat, his chair tilted back, boots crossed at the ankle. He didn't wave, didn't nod, just watched, his face obscured by shadows, a silhouette of the town's unspoken rules. Boone's jaw tightened. This place had always been a purgatory for drifters and deadbeats, its kindness rationed out like bullets. But the weight in his arms reminded him. These boys weren't his burden alone anymore. Inside the shack, the air hung thick with the scent of pine tar and mildew, the hearth cold for months. Boone's boots scuffed the floorboards, the sound sharp in the silence, as he laid the boys on his cot. Wyatt's hand clung to his sleeve even then, his fingers too weak to grip but unwilling to let go. Tate's eyelids fluttered, his pupils dilated and glassy, the fever painting fever dreams across his face. Boone lit a lantern, the flame guttering before steadying, and the light carved hollows into the boys' cheeks, their bones stark beneath the skin. He fetched water from the pump outside, the handle stiff with disuse, and boiled it over the fire, the steam curling in a ghost that clung to the rafters. When he reached for the blankets, his hand froze. The stack was neat, untouched, the top one still faintly patterned with the imprint of his son's small fists. He yanked it free, the fabric stiff with age, and wrapped Tate in it, the boys shivering subsiding into a fragile stillness. The fire crackled, its warmth licking at the edges of the room, but Boone stood motionless, his back to the wall, the weight of the day's silence pressing into him. Outside, the wind whispered through the eaves, carrying the distant clang of the blacksmith's anvil, a sound that once marked time in this town. Now it felt like a requiem. He stared at the boys' chests rising and falling, the rhythm uneven but relentless, and let the truth settle like dust. This wasn't rescue. It was a beginning, and beginnings demanded more than grit. They required a kind of faith he'd buried with his family. He exhaled, slow and deliberate, and reached for the whiskey bottle on the shelf. Not for the burn, but for the reminder that some things endured, even when they shouldn't. Even when the world tried to carve you hollow, leaving only scars and shadow. The clinic's walls, warped from years of desert heat, groaned softly as the wind clawed at the shutters, their cracks whispering secrets of past agonies. Doc Cade's breath hitched as he worked, the weight of too many silent nights pressing on his lungs. He'd seen men shattered by bullets, women hollowed by fever, but the sight of these boys, so still, so small, gnawed at something deeper. Wyatt's eyelids fluttered like trapped moths. His pupils dilated not just from pain, but from the kind of fear that etched itself into marrow. Tate's jaw was clenched so tight Doc feared he'd crack a tooth, his breath shallow, as though drawing air too deeply might alert whoever had left them to rot. The doctor's own wrists ached in sympathy, the memory of his daughter's fevered whimper cutting through him. Another life, another failure. He forced his hands steady, tearing the bandage strip with a crisp snick, the sound too loud in the room's brittle silence. Outside, the desert stretched endless and indifferent, its jagged horizon blurring into the boy's haunted stares. Boone's fists flexed at his sides, his coat stiff with dust and dried sweat, the revolver at his hip feeling suddenly useless. Chained to a cactus, the words festered in his throat. He tracked men through rattlesnake nests and Apache raids. But this was a kind of evil that didn't leave tracks. His gaze snagged on the frayed rope burns on Tate's neck, angry red wheels that pulsed in time with the boy's racing heartbeat. He wondered if they'd ever feel clean again, if the sand in their hair would ever wash out, or if it would cling like guilt. When Wyatt finally spoke, voice a fractured rasp asking for water, Boone's boots echoed like gunshots as he crossed the room, his hands trembling not from weakness, but the raw, unspoken vow to never let silence swallow them whole again. Lena lingered in the doorway, her silhouette sharp against the lantern-lit hall, her presence a blade slicing through the room's fragile stillness. She'd seen too much, too, her hands calloused from stitching wounds and souls alike. But her mouth tightened at the sight of the boy's trembling. "Trauma sticks," she muttered, more to herself than Boone, her voice lacking its usual steel. "They'll flinch at shadows long after they're gone." Her eyes lingered on Wyatt's wrist, the skin there a grotesque mosaic of purple and yellow, as if the bruises might crawl outward and stain the whole world. When she turned to Boone, her brow furrowed, not with doubt, but the weight of knowing what came next. "You'll need more than anger," she warned, her tone softer now, almost human. Boone didn't answer. He was too busy memorizing the way Tate's shoulders sagged with each labored breath, too busy vowing that every sunrise they survived would be a spit in the face of the monsters who made them crawl through hell to get here. The lantern's flame guttered, casting the room in a momentary gloom before surging back, its light carving jagged lines across the boys' faces. Doc exhaled, the whiskey on his breath mingling with the iron stench of blood, and wondered if redemption could be stitched from gauze and grit. Boone pulled his coat tighter, the desert wind howling a dirge outside, and decided right then that some ghosts were worth fighting. The cabin's cold clung to the walls like a second skin, the kind of chill that seeped into bones and refused to leave. Boone moved through the gloom, his shadow flickering against the plank walls as he stoked the fire, its embers hissing to life with a burst of heat. The pot of water on the stove bubbled lazily, steam curling upward to fog the low-hanging shelves where dust had settled in the cracks of forgotten routines. Cornbread sat in a tin pan, its edges golden and crisp, while a pan of beans simmered with a scent earthy and grounding. Boone set the food near the hearth, his hands lingering on the tin plates as he watched the boys. They hadn't moved since he'd tucked them into the quilts, their small frames curled tight against the cold, or something colder. Their shoes remained on, scuffed and too small, toes pressed against the floorboards as if braced for a sudden escape. Boone lowered himself into the rocker, the creak of its wooden frame the only sound in the room. The knife in his hand felt heavier than usual, its dull blade catching the firelight like a shard of memory. He didn't sharpen it. His fingers ached to do something, anything, but the weight of the boy's silence held him still. Wyatt stirred first, his brow furrowing as he mumbled into the quilt, "Mama." The words slithered through the air, sharp and raw. Tate stiffened beside him, his breath hitching, eyes snapping wide in the firelight. For a moment, Boone thought he might bolt, But the boy stayed rooted, his gaze darting to his brother, then to the door, then back to the flames. The fire crackled louder, a log snapping as if to fill the void. Somewhere beyond the cabin, a coyote howled, its cry stretching long and mournful into the night. By dawn, the boys hadn't shifted. Their stillness unnerved Boone, as though they'd mastered the art of fading into the background, of making themselves invisible, a survival skill honed in shadows he couldn't yet imagine. He rose quietly, the rocker groaning in protest, and set to work on breakfast. Corn mush thickened in the pan, its aroma mingling with the earthy tang of scrambled eggs. He didn't call them awake. Instead, he let the smells do the asking, the clatter of utensils against him a soft invitation. When Tate blinked open his eyes, his face tightened as memory hit. The cabin, the food, the man who hadn't left them. He nudged Wyatt with an elbow, his movements tentative, as if waking his brother might shatter whatever fragile safety they'd stumbled into. They ate like wolves, hands darting to the food with a desperation that made Boone's throat ache. Corn mush dribbled down Tate's chin, but he didn't pause, didn't slow, until his bowl was scraped clean. Wyatt followed, slower, methodical, his eyes never leaving Boone's face, as though measuring every gesture for hidden cruelty. When the last bite vanished, the cabin felt heavier, the air thick with unspoken things. Boone leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Names?" he asked, the words softer than he intended. Tate's voice cracked like dry wood. "He's Wyatt. I'm Tate." The admission hung between them, fragile and final, a thread woven into the silence, tying them together in a way Boone wasn't ready to name. Outside, the wind shifted, rattling the shutters like a warning. But inside, the fire burned steady, its warmth creeping into the corners of the room, into the seams of the boy's silence, into the hollow ache in Boone's chest. He didn't speak as they finished eating, didn't press for more. Some truths couldn't be rushed. They'd given him their names, and for now, that was enough. A foothold in the darkness, a promise unspoken but understood. The boys' shoes still hugged their feet, their laces frayed and untied, but Boone said nothing. He knew the weight of holding onto something small when the world had tried to take everything else. Instead, he added another log to the fire and waited, the knife in his hand forgotten, its edge dulled by the quiet resolve settling in his bones. Days settled into a rhythm neither fast nor fragile, a quiet cadence stitched together by routine and unspoken understanding. Boone gave the boys space, moving through his chores with deliberate slowness, his boots crunching over gravel as he chopped wood or repaired the sagging fence near the chicken coop. From the cabin's single window, he watched them hover near the back wall, their small faces pressed to the glass like ghosts peering into a world they still distrusted. Their eyes tracked every movement, the swing of his axe, the creak of the well pump, the flick of Dusty's tail as she grazed nearby. But they didn't venture outside. Not yet. The world beyond the cabin's walls still carried the weight of too many unknowns. When Boone brought in firewood, the boys flinched at the thud of logs hitting the floor, their shoulders tensing as if bracing for a blow. He set the last piece down slow, his hands raised in silent reassurance. "Ain't nobody coming," he said, the words rough but steady. Tate's eyes flicked to Boone's calloused hands, the same hands that had cut the wire from their wrists, now stained with sawdust and sweat. "You don't know that," the boy muttered, his voice low but edged with defiance. Boone crouched, meeting his gaze at eye level. The firelight caught the boy's trembling jaw, the faint scar on his knuckle. "No," Boone admitted, his thumb brushing the hilt of his knife absently. "But they'd have to come through me first." The words hung in the air, a promise neither grand nor loud, but one that seemed to settle something in Tate's chest. He nodded once, the motion stiff but deliberate, before retreating to Wyatt's side. That afternoon, Boone washed their clothes himself, the tub of steaming water balanced on the porch rail. He scrubbed the dirt from their shirts with a bar of lye soap, the scent sharp and cleansing, and hung them to dry in the sun. When he handed them flannel shirts, too big but soft from years of wear, the boys hesitated, fingers hovering over the fabric as if expecting it to vanish. Wyatt tugged his on first, the sleeves swallowing his arms, and wandered to the barn where Dusty stood tethered. He brushed her mane with slow, careful strokes, humming a tune Boone couldn't place. It was faint, almost hesitant, but the melody curled through the air like smoke from a dying fire. When Tate joined in, his voice thin but true, the song took shape. A lullaby, Boone realized, something their mother must have taught them. For a heartbeat, the ache in his chest sharpened, raw and unfamiliar. Wyatt's humming grew bolder, the rhythm steadier, until Tate laughed, a sound so startled, so bright, it made Boone's throat tighten. It wasn't just the laughter itself, though it was the first genuine joy he'd heard from either boy. It was the way Wyatt's face lit up at it, how Tate clutched his stomach as if startled by his own joy, how the sound seemed to shake loose something trapped in the corners of the cabin. Boone turned back to the firewood, pretending not to notice the tear Tate swiped from his cheek or the way Wyatt's shoulders relaxed for the first time since arriving. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and dust, and for the first time, the silence between them felt less like a barrier and more like a shared breath. As dusk settled, the boys lingered near the barn, their shadows stretching long against the ground. Boone watched them from the porch, his coffee cooling in his hand. They didn't speak much, but their movement spoke volumes. The way Wyatt nudged a stick into Tate's hands, the way Tate swung it like a sword, the way they both laughed when Dusty snorted at their antics. Boone's chest ached again, but this time it wasn't grief. It was something else entirely, a fragile, flickering hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd find their way to something like peace. The stranger arrived 2 weeks later, his boots caked in dust like he'd ridden through every lie he carried. Finn Carver dismounted with the practiced ease of a man who'd never known hunger or fear, his slicked-back hair gleaming under the high-noon sun. His suit, a tailored masterpiece of arrogance, clung to him like armor, its fabric crisp and unyielding, as if stitched to hide the rot beneath. In his hand, he clutched a sheaf of papers, their edges sharp enough to slice through doubt. He strode into the town square with the confidence of a man who'd already won, his smile a thin, practiced curve. "Blood and law," he declared, holding the documents aloft like a banner. "That's what binds them to me. Not sentiment, not theft." The crowd murmured, a low hum of uncertainty, as Boone stood silent, his jaw tight, eyes locked on the man who dared to claim the boys as his own. Then Tate stepped forward, his small frame trembling, but his voice steady, raw with memory. "You were there. Mama screamed. You said if we cried, we'd get worse." The words cracked through the square like a gunshot, silencing the whispers. Finn's smile faltered, his pale skin paling further as the boys' gaze bore into him. The crowd held its breath, the weight of the accusation hanging thick in the air. Lena stirred first, her arms uncrossing as she exchanged a glance with Bess Carver, who stepped up beside the boys, her presence a quiet anchor. "Children lie about fear," Finn sneered, recovering quickly, his voice dripping with disdain. "They twist truths into nightmares." But Wyatt, the quieter twin, whispered then, his voice barely audible, yet cutting through the tension like a blade. "Mama said we'd find someone kind. So we ran." The crowd shifted, unease rippling through the onlookers. Boone didn't speak. He let the weight of the boys' words settle. Let the townsfolk see the tremor in their shoulders, the shadows in their eyes, the scars no bandage could hide. When the sheriff finally called for a verdict, the decision came swift and unanimous. The town chose Boone. Finn's face contorted, his mask of civility cracking as he spat curses under his breath. his papers crumpling in his fist. He left in a cloud of dust, his horse galloping hard enough to scatter chickens and kick up a storm of grit. But the victory felt hollow until the telegram arrived days later. It revealed his arrest for fraud, a string of false claims across territories, and a trail of stolen children left in his wake. Yet even as the news spread, Boone couldn't shake the lingering ache. The knowledge that men like Finn existed, that cruelty could wear a smile and carry papers. He watched the boys that night as they slept near the hearth, their breathing slow and unbroken, and vowed silently no one would ever chain them again, not while he still drew breath. The confrontation lingered in the town's bones long after Finn vanished. At the saloon, whispers coiled around glasses of whiskey. How a boy's voice had undone a man's lies. How the twins had stared down a predator with nothing but truth. Lena, usually sharp-tongued, avoided the subject entirely, though she left a fresh loaf of bread on Boone's porch the next morning. Bess Carver brought a jar of violets she'd pressed into wax paper, placing it silently on the table before retreating to the barn to mend a broken harness. The boys, meanwhile, seemed unchanged on the surface. Tate still hummed while brushing Dusty's mane. Wyatt still traced patterns in the dirt. But Boone noticed the way their shoulders hunched when strangers passed, how Wyatt's hand twitched toward his brother's whenever the wind carried distant hoofbeats. Finn's papers became a grim curiosity. Doc Cade kept them in his desk drawer, occasionally pulling them out to study the ink, as if the signatures might confess their own falsity. Men like him, the doctor muttered once, don't stop. They just learn new names. Boone didn't respond, but he added an extra lock to the cabin door that night, its metal cold and solid under his calloused hands. The boys never asked about it. They didn't need to. By the time the telegram arrived, the town had already begun weaving the story into its folklore. Levi Strode tacked a copy of a notice to the sheriff's office door, though no one needed proof. The real evidence lay in the twins' laughter, real now, unguarded, as they chased Dusty through the yard, their shoes thudding against the earth like a promise. Boone read the telegram twice, then folded it into his pocket, its words a balm and a warning. Justice, he thought, but not closure. There was no undoing what Finn had done, no erasing the way fear had etched itself into the boy's bones. But there was this, a home, a fire, a man who stayed. That night, as the desert wind howled beyond the walls, Boone sat by the hearth, sharpening his knife for no reason other than the rhythm of it. The scrape of steel, the flicker of flame. Tate slept curled like a question mark, one hand clutching Wyatt's sleeve even in dreams. Wyatt murmured something about violets, his voice soft as dust. Boone didn't move. He listened until their breathing synced, until the wind outside softened to a sigh. The telegram's edges pressed against his thigh through his coat, a reminder that some battles ended not with gunfire, but with the stubborn, quiet act of holding on to what mattered. Finn was gone. The papers were ash in the stove. The boys were his, and the desert, for all its secrets, had finally learned to keep them. Seasons turned, their passage marked not by calendars, but by the rhythm of the land. The brittle crunch of winter's frost underfoot, the riot of wildflowers in spring, the relentless sun of summer that bleached the hills to gold. The boys grew into their laughter, their chores, their place at the table. But it was the small, unspoken moments that etched their transformation into Boone's bones. On the porch one morning, he watched Tate kneel behind Wyatt, threading a sky-blue ribbon into his brother's hair. A scrap of fabric Boone had found tangled in the thorn bush months ago, its edges frayed but its color stubbornly vivid. Wyatt didn't flinch at the touch, didn't pull away. He just whispered, "Mama's," as if the ribbon carried her fingerprints, her voice, the scent of her skin. Boone said nothing. He let the moment linger, fragile and holy, before turning back to the stove where cornbread sizzled in the skillet. The cabin smelled of cinnamon and coffee, of something like hope. The room Boone built for them took weeks, his hands blistered from hammering nails into the pine boards he'd hauled from the ridge. He added the window himself, cutting through the wall with deliberate care, ensuring it faced east so the first light of dawn would spill across their beds. But nights remained the same. The boys still slept near the hearth, curled beneath quilts they'd helped patch, their shoes lined up neatly by the door, clean, empty, but always within reach. It was a habit born of survival. Boone knew, a reflex no amount of safety could erase. Still, he left the window open when the weather warmed, letting the desert breeze carry in the scent of sagebrush and rain. At the spring picnic, the town's collective breath held as Tate stepped forward to sing with the schoolchildren. His voice wavered at first, thin and uncertain, but halfway through the hymn, he reached for Wyatt's hand, their fingers interlocking like a promise. The crowd swelled around them, faces blurred by sunlight and tears, but Boone saw it all. The way Wyatt's shoulders relaxed, the way Tate's voice steadied, the way the townsfolk rose as one when the final note faded. Lena dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief she'd never admit was damp. Levi Strode stood stiff but proud, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver as if guarding the moment from unseen threats. Even Bess Carver, ever quiet, pressed a hand to Boone's shoulder, her grip firm, her smile soft. Later, as dusk painted the sky in hues of copper and lavender, the boys handed Boone a folded note. Their handwriting was clumsy, uneven. "We love you. We are yours." The words blurred as Boone read them, his throat tightening around the weight of them. He knelt, pulling them close, their small bodies trembling against his chest. "You're mine already," he murmured, the admission raw and unvarnished. The crowd didn't cheer. They wept quietly, openly, the sound mingling with the wind's low hum through the cottonwoods. That night, the cabin hummed with stillness. The hearth glowed, casting long shadows that danced over the walls where the boys' drawings now hung. Crude sketches of Dusty, the cactus grove, a woman with no face but a crown of violets. Boone sat in the rocker, the note tucked in his shirt pocket, and listened to their breathing, slow, even alive. The cinnamon lingered, sharp and sweet, a contrast to the earthy scent of the quilts. Peace, he realized, wasn't a destination carved into the horizon. It wasn't a grand gesture or a distant promise. It was here, in the rise and fall of their breath, in the quiet courage of a man who stayed. It was in the shoes by the door, no longer worn to sleep, but left there out of habit, a relic of fear slowly losing its grip. Outside, the stars blinked down like old friends, and the wind carried no whispers of ghosts. Boone let his head rest against the rocker's back. The ache in his chest softened. Not gone, but quieter, a scar instead of a wound. The boys stirred in their sleep, Wyatt mumbling something about violets, Tate clutching the edge of the quilt. Boone didn't move. He stayed, as he always did, as he always would, the weight of them anchoring him to something like grace.